Great. Okay, so our final presentation of this morning is going to be by Cecelia Eure. Cecelia is a Lois F. McNeil Fellow in the Wittich program. She's in between her first and second years. Traditionally, the Wittich Fellows take a great Southern odyssey, and this year it coincided with our Summer Institute. So we're really grateful that she chose to spend some time with us, and it's been great having her. So she will be presenting today her talk, Crossing the Atlantic, a Charleston Silver Dish Cross from the shop of Charles Wittich. Cecelia?
Good morning. At the turn of the 19th century, the United States wanted to be the next great democracy, just like Greece before it. And its citizens sought to display their status and power over things like time, space, and heat. The easiest place to do this, you ask? The dinner table. This dish cross, made in Charleston by Christian Charles Lewis Wittich, who I will refer to as Charles Wittich from now on, currently cataloged to be made between 1795 and 1805, is the product and representative of four intersecting forces: a German-American immigrant artisan, high society English culture, the new republic in Charleston, and free and enslaved labor. Elite Charleston society and the labor that it required to maintain it in the federal period can best be understood by looking in the dining room. Not only did the meal need to be kept warm, especially in a period where kitchens were often in a separate building from the dining room, but dinner party hosts aimed to showcase their socioeconomic status through their tablescapes. In Charleston, enslaved servants set up, served, cleaned, and maintained the refined dining tables of the Charleston elite. In his 1827 book, The House Servants' Directory, African-American New England butler Robert Roberts outlines his methods for maintaining a household. Roberts' guide was instrumental to my understanding of the domestic labor put into this piece. Because of the labor required to use a piece like this, one way for white Charlestonians to signal status and awareness of English trends was through ownership of something like a silver dish cross, simultaneously signaling their connections with the Atlantic world. I do apologize for talking about food and dining right before we're about to break for lunch. Bear with me, and I'll try not to discuss anything too mouthwatering. One question that I always like to ask myself when approaching a museum object is, why does this particular institution have this particular object? This dish cross was purchased by Mesda's Frank Horton in 1976 from a New York dealer with no provenance, and it was later donated by Horton to Mesda. The Charleston connection from Charles Wittich's mark, imprinted 16 times on the bottom of this piece, is key to why this piece is at Mesda. Charles Wittich was a German immigrant and Charleston silversmith. There was debate at Mesda prior to the purchase of this piece as to whether or not it was made in Charleston by Charles Wittich, or if he just imported it from London and stamped it, as Wittich advertised selling London-made dish crosses. It was purchased nonetheless, as the silver piece does not have any English marks, which would have been required in this period. Later correspondence from former Mesda research archivist Rosemary Estes in 1986, who consulted then Mesda Director of Publications and skilled silversmith John Bivens, notes that the hollow feet on the dish cross would have been crushed if they were marked after they were put together. Thus, I operate under the assumption that this piece was made in Wittich's shop. For ease, I refer to the piece being made by Wittich rather than his shop, though it may not have been made by him personally. Wittich's personal life is also fascinating on its own, but I will unfortunately have to leave you wondering a little bit about leading speculations regarding his past. This dish cross is intended to hold and heat a serving dish from below and protect the dining table that it sits on. The four-arm frame has movable arms and a lamp in the center for a spirit for burning and a wick to be inserted. There is an additional raised silver piece surrounding and supporting the wick in the center. Around this are two circular elements that rotate around the spirit lamp. Each element has a soldered rectangular arm on each side, At the end of each arm is what looks like a small round button. The piece's legs are attached to each arm and slide along the length of them. 2 attached C scrolls come out the top and bottom of this rectangular mortise. On the top is an element for the dish to rest on, shaped like a bicycle seat. On the bottom, the Y-shaped curve rests atop a hollow half sphere. This dish cross aims to be as versatile as possible when it comes to the size and shape of the dish it holds. There is also a piece of wood in the mortise of the leg to help hold it in place along the tenon when not in motion. The wood is held in place from the bottom with a small pin. Currently, no museum catalogs report having wood in their silver dish crosses, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't there. This may also provide the added benefit of insulation. Future wood analysis on this piece may allow for further confirmation of the American origin. While there aren't any other extant Charleston dish crosses, various institutions hold American-made ones. This Philadelphia example from Colonial Williamsburg has similar C scrolls to the Wittich one. Also from Philadelphia, this dish cross is owned by the US Department of State and has cutout designs. Finally, at Winniter, this New York dish cross by Gerardus Boyce is a later example dated 1820 to 1840. Additionally, despite English origins of the form, there is one extant dish cross design circa 1800 made in Germany from silversmith Joseph Anton C. Thaler II. The style of dishwarmer did make it out of England and its former colonies. The dishes that sit on dish crosses can be made of silver, porcelain, stoneware, lead-glazed earthenware, or any other heat-resistant material. Pewter and Delftware would not work and would melt under the heat. This image places a cooked bird and peas on the silver dish atop the dish cross. I imagine that in reality, whatever entree is in the dish would be servable without carving first to prevent the lit dish cross from shaking or the plate sliding off. Perhaps soups and sauces would have been more commonly placed on the dish cross. I'm curious as to the possibility of burn marks on the dishes. As a part of the thoughtfully placed tablescape, however, the enslaved servants who set the tables would have intentionally paired a dish with the dish cross. More than likely, the dish cross would have been placed in the center of a dining table or on a sideboard during the meal. Essential to the dish cross is that once it's placed down on the surface and lit, it cannot be safely moved because the legs would likely slide around when lifted. The dish sitting on it would also become too hot to touch. This piece was made during a transition period for dining styles in America. Nonetheless, it lends itself to a stationary setting despite versatility regarding size and shape. The earliest dish crosses did not have spirit lamps and were simply meant to elevate the dish from the table to protect it, much like a trivet. Dish crosses without lamps continued to be made in conjunction with those with lamps for decades. For a dish cross without a lamp, there's also the opportunity to place a lamp under the cross and allow heat to go through the holes cut or cast in the silver. The dish cross is an English form developed in the second quarter of the 18th century. It came to North America not long after, but it was never as popular here as it was in England. According to the Victoria and Albert Museum in the United Kingdom, dish crosses died out by 1800. This was not the case in the United States, as we see several examples made in the US after this date. English silver was sought after and could be identified by standardized markings. Historian Maury D. McGinnis identified in The Politics of Taste in Antebellum Charleston that elite Charlestonians notably tended to continue to identify with English identity and culture through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The wealth of planter elites in Charleston in the colonial and antebellum periods that would later perpetuate the lost cause narrative following the Civil War allowed for elite Charlestonians to have a greater connection with London conventions and culture. Before the dish cross, there was the infinitely popular and still used today, most commonly in catering services, chafing dish. Coming in different forms, the chafing dish heats food from the embers below and can be used for small amounts of cooking. The chafing dish appears in the homes of individuals from every social class. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, chafing dishes were still all the rage. In Frank Scholesser's 1904 book, The Cult of the Chafing Dish, he starts off by announcing, "Every bachelor has a wife of some sort. Mine is a chafing dish, and I desire to sing her praises." He later identifies her as Chafina. Scholesser illustrates the popularity of the chafing dish well as he praises and explains all the uses of the dining tool. The earliest method of food warming is simply by covering dishes with a lid. But according to convention, once the guest's on the table, a lid was to be immediately removed, as Robert Roberts states. Thus, covers do not keep the food warm throughout the meal. Sometimes these dishes would have had warming pans on the bottom, filled with hot water to provide heat after the cover was removed. Simultaneously, the fixed dish ring was a form primarily produced in Dublin. It was sold to the American market alongside dish crosses by Wittich and other merchants. The 19th century also brought about the popularity of warming dishes. These have 3 layers. At the bottom is a heated iron block, and above it is a layer filled with water. Steam exits through the holes in the top where the dish is placed. The dish cross certainly did not come out of nowhere, and it is one of the many methods of maintaining heat on the dining table that provides aesthetic value as well. The Wittich dish cross is a part of a decades-long English and American silversmithing tradition that decorated wealthy Charleston homes. Wittich first advertised that he was working as a goldsmith and jeweler in Charleston on King Street in April 1785. Some scholars speculate that he came to the United States as a Hessian soldier and defected. His absence from the record is until he advertises again in 1794 that he is no longer working on Meeting Street and has moved to Broad Street. This time, he identifies himself as a jeweler, gold, and silversmith. Based on matching addresses, it's my belief that Wittich was working as a journeyman in the shop of silversmith William Whiteman on Meeting Street, who has no extant pieces to my knowledge. Whiteman was English and often advertised importing plated dish crosses, as Wittich later does. Wittich worked in his own shop on Broad Street from 1794 until he advertised in 1802 that he would be going into business with his brother Friedrich under the names C and F Wittich. He noted that he would finish any promised work under his own name. This partnership lasted until 1806, when Charles chose to strictly work as a merchant and Frederick continued silversmithing. While this is the only confirmed extant Wittich and Charleston dish cross, Charlestonians would have been familiar with the form. As I previously mentioned, the form had been popular in England for several decades prior to this piece being made. Charlestonians were generally Anglophiles and craved English styles in their homes. Wittich began to advertise imported silver and jewelry from London in 1799, and in 1800 he advertised plated silver dish crosses for the first time. Plated forms were much less expensive than pure silver. Wittich does not advertise non-plated imported dish crosses. Though he was born in Germany, Wittich marketed to the taste of Anglo-Charlestonians as seen through his advertisements. Along with his advertisements selling imported wares, Wittich sometimes noted that he could create any complicated silver piece that he was commissioned to make, especially, as he noted in a November 1801 advertisement, because he hired 2 workmen from London to help him in his shop. As he began importing dish crosses in 1800, brought in workmen in late 1801, after he reported a trip to Europe that spring, and started working with his brother in late 1802, I suspect that the silver dish cross was made sometime in late 1801 or early to mid 1802. However, dish crosses were not new in 1800, so it's possible that Wittich made this piece at any point in his career. The piece would have likely been made to order, with Wittich borrowing from what he knew from the London-made plated dish crosses that came through his shop. Possibly, the 2 Englishmen that worked for Wittich in this period had made or witnessed the making of a dish cross while they were in London. The purchaser would have been aware of dish crosses, but wanted a more valuable solid silver piece instead of the plated versions Wittich sold. Interestingly, though this would have been purchased in part to signal status, this piece does not have the same highly stylized, molded Rococo designs on the feet that appear in most dish crosses, possibly because it was influenced by neoclassicism, or Wittich simply did not have the molds. A variety of silversmithing methods went into the production of this piece. It blends methods of casting used to create arms and legs of the piece with hammered pieces like the lamp. The various elements are soldered together to form a complete dish cross. Rather than sticking to one process, each piece is made with the method Wittich deemed most appropriate for the shape that he was trying to create. Wittich put out multiple advertisements looking for a young boy to apprentice in his shop. In the 1800 census, Wittich reported that his household contained one free white person aged 16 to 25, likely an apprentice, one free white person aged 26 to 44, Wittich, and one enslaved person. Later, Wittich enslaved at least 3 more people, a woman named Tempe and her sons, John and Billy, purchased in 1803. While this is later than the creation of this piece likely, I find his involvement in the slave trade to be relevant nonetheless. Whiteman is his likely former employer, also has records of having enslaved workers in his shop and home, reporting 7 in the 1790 census. Enslaved hands were likely part of the making and use of this piece. Enslaved and free labor involved in this piece does not end with its making. While the dish cross looks beautiful sitting on a table, protects the finely polished mahogany, and provides convenient warmth, maintaining its appearance was not an easy task. Though he does not address the dish cross, Robert Roberts writes about methods for cleaning silver candlesticks. Roberts suggests that servants take great care to avoid scratches and wash candlesticks with hot and soapy water and flannel, and instructs them to dry the silver as quickly as possible. There's a great deal of privilege in being able to have a piece that hardly is ever seen maintained. Likely, the white owners never touched the dish cross themselves. Relatively uncommon objects like this show how elite and Anglo-obsessed Charleston could be. The dish cross in Charleston is a product of the Atlantic world. In this case, intersecting German immigrant artisan identity, English design, the early republic in Charleston, and the work of free and enslaved laborers make up the identity of this piece. While the Wittich attribution brought this piece to Mazda, the displays of status and identity that come with this piece are illustrative of the early 19th century Charleston more broadly. And thank you to everyone who has supported me throughout this process and with my research.